Hello, everybody. This is Dallas Woodhouse, Executive Director of the South Carolina Policy Council. So glad you could join us today as we announce a new plan, charting a new course, a slightly different course for South Carolina called our Sustainable Budget. It's basically a blueprint to protect South Carolina from future overspending and to pave the way to some much needed tax relief here in the Palmetto State. We've had some recent tax cuts, but South Carolina continues to be behind its neighbors when it comes to tax relief, still having some of the highest tax rates in the Southeast. So we want to put forward a plan, a blueprint to help South Carolina to make sure our state spending levels are sustainable, to get us going on the right path in the future and pave the way for future tax cuts so South Carolina doesn't lose its comparative advantage. Every state is out there fighting hard to recruit new business, recruit jobs, and we do know that tax rates matter. Taxes matter. Capital follows where it is able to do the most good and where it is encumbered the least. Joining us today is, of course, my colleague here at the Policy Council, our Director of Policy, our research guru, and a good friend of mine, Bryce Fiedler.
Happy to be
also
here.
Joining us today, who has helped us on this project, is the Chief Economist for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Vance Ginn. Vance, thank you so much. Bryce, tell us about this policy report that we've put together and that's going to be released.
Sure. Well, we are announcing today the South Carolina Sustainable Budget. And the basic idea is that we look at the last decade of South Carolina general fund appropriations, and we compare those to what spending would have looked like across that same period if it were limited to population growth plus inflation. And so this initial report is basically a snapshot of the last decade comparing those two spending tracks. And we came up with and found some really interesting pieces of data through this process. And then a second report will actually make our first formal recommendations for a South Carolina sustainable budget heading into fiscal year 2024. And Vance has been instrumental in making this project happen. Vance, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of just the background of the sustainable budget? I know some other states call it a conservative budget and maybe the value that it offers.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bryce, and thank you, Dallas, and thank you for all the work that y'all do there in South Carolina. You want it to be as free and prosperous as possible, and y'all are set a good stage to do that with all the great work that you do. So please keep that going. As you said, I've done some good work on tax cuts and tax reforms, and one of the best ways to make sure that you can sustain those tax cuts and reforms is to have a sustainable budget. We learned from some of the, I guess you could say, mistakes, issues that have happened with Kansas back in the day where they made some pretty substantial tax cuts, but the spending side of the ledger didn't have the same restraint put in place on government, and they ran up into deficits and had to raise taxes, and it created a lot of concern, for rightfully so, for a lot of Kansans there. And so there was a push to make some key reforms there. We've also seen too much spending in a lot of places. The ultimate burden of government is not by how much it taxes, but by how much it spends. So if we don't put in place key limitations, a strong fiscal rule that limits government spending, then you're going to run into the situation where you have massive taxes that are going to stifle economic growth and prosperity for small businesses, for families to put food on their table and things of that nature. And look, at a time whenever the federal government is out of control with their federal spending and running up massive deficits, and inflation is close to 10%, we've got a lot of issues that are going on. And so it's great to see states like South Carolina really start to hone in on government spending as being the problem. I've been working on this type of issue now for quite a while. In Texas, we started what was called the Conservative Texas Budget in 2015. We helped slow the growth of spending by cutting the growth rate in half over over the next 4 budgets compared to the prior 6 budgets, and provided tax relief in the process. We finally got a spending limit reform based on a lot of the key things that's in this type of budgeting and here in 2021 in Texas. And so I'm looking forward to what South Carolina is going to do as we continue to compete to have hopefully the best fiscal policy possible. So thank you for all y'all are doing.
And I think it is really important to pick up on what Vance said. We are looking for South Carolina to have the best policy possible. We did not come here to tell you that South Carolina has been massively overspending and it's crazy overspending and they're getting ready to force tax increases. But we think South Carolina can do a little better. And what we really want to see is a limitation of future spending increases to basically match our population increases and inflation. We recognize, as much as we sometimes have to grin our teeth and bear it, that government's going to grow sometimes. But it ought to grow in proportion to how the state is growing and the value of the dollar. What we see in states is so often, I personally spent a long time in North Carolina. We saw this in the 90s and in the 2000s. Is states way overspend when times are good. They have some euphoria and they get to do a lot of things, and some of them are good projects, some of them aren't. But then inevitably the economy takes a downturn, and and all of a sudden we have major budget deficits, and there's real pressure on state government to raise taxes, which of course we're not in favor, and at times make huge cuts in government at one time, which is very unpalatable but to people. And both of those should be avoided, basically to limit your spending increases on a voluntary basis. We're not talking about right now amending the Constitution in South Carolina. We want our lawmakers, many of which have made public commitments and have done a pretty good job in the areas of fiscal restraint. We'd like to see them adopt this as a principle, that we're going to limit the growth of government to population and inflation increases. Bryce?
That's right. And there's a couple critical implications here for South Carolina as well. South Carolina recently cut and simplified its state income tax, reducing the top rate from 7 to 6.5 and then consolidating the lower bracket. But critically, that rate will continue to drop to 6% over the next coming years. However, we know that responsible spending and smart budgeting is key to being able to accelerate not only that process, but to fuel tax cuts in other areas. Similarly, we know that overspending has an immediate price tag, obviously, but it also creates government, grows government, which tends to continue to grow down the road, right? If you create a new program or a new state agency, it's very unlikely it's going to stay at that same size over the next several years. So you have to think about the long-term implications of excessive government growth as well. And if you just look at the economic conditions that we'll likely soon to be facing, as we see signs that we may be entering a recession, it would seem like a very good time to start to get spending under control. Vance, anything to add to that point there?
I think you're exactly right, Bryce, and I love the points you're making there as well, Dallas. I mean, I think you're right on target where this is at. It's why it's so crucial. I mean, I think that one of the lessons that we've learned from this sort of fiscal rules, sort of a budget marker that's put out there to say, how is the budget done compared to population growth plus inflation? I mean, that measure itself may not mean a lot, but it really does have a lot of meaning. It really means what's the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending is ultimately what it comes down to, because this was mentioned briefly earlier, but it's basically like, hey, how many more people can pay for government? That's your population. You have inflation that's typically highly tied to wage growth over time. Not so much right now, given a lot of the higher inflation, but I think you put the two together and you allow for economies of scale to also come into the situation and show how much the average taxpayer can afford. And so when you're putting in these key reforms on the tax cut side, which are huge there in South Carolina, I'm so glad glad to see y'all doing that. Hope y'all continue to do that sort of thing to put more pressure on other states like Texas and others. But this is a great opportunity to make sure that you're keeping spending restrained, and I think that goes into a lot of the details. I think maybe we can dive into a little bit for the budget numbers. But look, because South Carolina's been doing a better job here recently of bringing in government spending growth compared to population plus inflation. But the concern always is what happens in the future? What's going to be the growth rates? And so if you start putting out this objective metric that the public can understand, that other interested folks can understand, it really starts to change the tone about how much government should be spending. It's not just that we need to rein in government, which is kind of esoteric. Nobody knows what that really means. This actually puts a number to it. It puts a growth rate to it and says, you know what? Below this is going to keep us sustainable. Above that is not.
Bryce, what do those numbers look like?
Well, we looked at spending over the last decade and found that, unfortunately, our appropriations have exceeded sustainable budget numbers in every year. And so in total, our appropriations were about $7 billion higher than what they would be under a sustainable budget. Now, what does that mean for taxpayers? We found that by not following a sustainable budget over this period, individual taxpayers carry an extra burden of around $180, while families of four carry an additional burden of about $718.
And I think when you break down the last decade worth of growth rates, what you can really see is that from 2013 to 2017, the growth rate in the general fund budget grew by 5.7% compared to population plus inflation of 2.6%. So, basically more than twice as fast was government spending growth. And since 2018 to 2022 budget, the growth rate of the general fund budget was 4.1% and population plus inflation was 4.3. So it was actually below that. So if you look at the full 10-year period, we had a 4.8% growth rate in the general fund budget and 3.6% increase in population plus inflation. So it was above. But like I said, the last few years have really started to get back on track, which is going to allow for South Carolina to be able to uphold these sort of key tax reforms that have taken place. And as Bryce was getting at, though, there is always room for improvement. You want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on that there still is a burden that's on taxpayers across South Carolina from that excessive spending from that earlier part of the last decade. So you want to continue to try to be below population growth plus inflation as much as possible. And it's a key point here too, that population plus inflation is not a target. You don't set that out there and say, this is where you want to hit. That is a maximum. Ideally, you want to be below that rate, and that way you can start to correct some of those excessive spending from past years.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that all states every state in the union is going to face a reckoning, because all states have had their spending inflated due to COVID, and eventually those large payments from the federal government to the states will dissipate, and states are going to have to deal with that. I think it is also important to realize that this is part of what we think is the grand plan for South Carolina for sustainability and for growth, and it includes a couple of things: the voluntary spending limit, efforts to keep lowering taxes, reducing burdensome regulations, and something we'll be writing and talking about later this year is voters have the opportunity to pass a couple of amendments to the state constitution that will require government to save a little more, put a little more away for a rainy day. And why is that important? If we've learned nothing through COVID, it is this: that crises fuel, fund, and foster bigger, expansive, and crushing government. And we've seen that, through just the massive expansion of government through COVID. What else is considered a crisis? When you get into a recession, when taxpayer resources and tax collections dwindle, then government feels like it's in a crisis and bad things happen. Tax increases happen. Sometimes cuts to important programs happen in ways that aren't thoughtful. Sometimes you have layoffs. And so part of the grand plan, as we see it, adopt the voluntary spending limits, whittle your tax rates down, save a little more for a rainy day. So when you do have a recession, you don't have to respond with sort of draconian tax increases or cuts. You can weather the storm and keep going.
That's exactly right. And just to reiterate, the purpose of this report was just to get a kind of gauge of where we are and what our spending has been like over the past decade. And I think there are some maybe not uncomfortable numbers here, but things that we would like to see improved. And that's what we're going to be working on. And that's why in the future, Vance and I will partner to do a 2024 fiscal year budget recommendations for the sustainable budget.
And it'll be a great time, too, because we do have all those things you just mentioned, Dallas, of the economy and what's happening. And we may have another bill that it looks like Congress is going to pass soon with this quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act. And so there's going to be some more headwinds that are along the way that really drives the point home of the reason for the sustainable South Carolina budget, to ensure that those tax cuts and reforms stay the way they are and don't pressure politicians to make changes that they don't want to make. I think will be key. But also, looking at other types of taxes that are across the state that you may want to provide for relief in the future. I know something we've been looking at a lot in Texas is property taxes, and those keep going, ratcheting up higher and higher. It's a big burden that we have here that we've got to make sure we look at it. And at the end of the day, this is really about making sure that South Carolina, those families that are in South Carolina can put food on the table and not have a higher and higher cost of living that's already being driven so much by DC. This is going to help to weather some of that storm. You can't mitigate it. You're not immune to it, but the state can help to provide some sort of roadblocks, if you will, from being overrun by all the things that are happening at the federal level.
Yeah, at a minimum, we cannot exacerbate the problem.
Yes.
And I think it's important, and we want to see South Carolina be a leader. And we have a lot of conservative leaders in South Carolina, but it's important that conservative leaders do conservative things. And following a sustainable budget outline with voluntary spending limits is just that. Well, we hope you'll read the report, send it around to your friends, visit South Carolina Policy Council.org, visit our website. Also see us on Facebook and social media and on Twitter. We'll release that report. If you have any questions, follow up with us. We'd love to hear from you. So watch for that report, and let's get South Carolina spending on a sustainable conservative future to make South Carolina's future as bright and shiny as possible. Thank you, everybody.